All right, so for next time, we're going to be finishing up Candide, right? So you're just going to read the last couple chapters. It's about about 18 more pages, right? And once again, you're going to choose a passage on which to do a free write. I don't have the free writes from last time to get back to you. I just haven't had time yet. But you will get those back on Tuesday. You'll get everything back on Tuesday. Right? I will get everything reviewed and get your feedback over the weekend. And then after the Voltaire, remember that we're going to be looking at Rousseau's social contract, right? So you start bringing that to class with you as of Thursday. And I'll give you the first reading assignment from that on Tuesday. But does anybody have any questions about assignments or anything before we get started? Okay. Does anybody have any questions about stuff that we went over last time? So all that stuff about the Enlightenment and Leibniz and Theodicy and Voltaire responding to Leibniz, or do either of you have any questions at all about that? I'm going to give you a minute. I want you to look at your notes from Tuesday and just see if there's anything you want further explanation on, okay? Leibniz.
So we said it because earlier.
Okay, so Leibniz. Okay, so Leibniz was the guy with the enormous wig, right? Right, mathematician and philosopher. And he's the guy who wrote that book in 1710 called Theodicy. Now, do either of you remember what a Theodicy is? Like what Theodicy means? Okay, yeah, we see the prefix theo, right? That's from the Greek for God, so it's something to do with religion, right? Theodicy specifically is an attempt to explain the existence of evil in the world, right? And the basic problem here that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries is, if there is an all-good, all-powerful God, then why does he allow evil to exist, right? Why does he allow bad things to happen to people? And Jennifer, do you happen to remember what Leibniz's answer to that question was?
Everything happens for a reason.
That's part of it, right? But the bigger part of it is this idea that...
Every cause has an effect.
What's that?
Every cause has an effect.
Every cause has an effect. Yeah, that's also part of it. But these are kind of subsidiary arguments in the bigger argument, right? And Leibniz's bigger argument is that because God is all good and all powerful, he created the best world that it is possible to create, right? That if it were possible to build a better world, that's what God would have done. But clearly it isn't, because this is what we've got. So, this is how Leibniz tries to reconcile the existence of evil in the world with the idea of an all-good and all-powerful God, right? And the cause and effect and sufficient reason stuff, yeah, this is all part of it, right? So, best of all possible worlds is the big part of it, right? But the best of all possible worlds for someone like Leibniz, who's a mathematician as well as a philosopher, is a well-ordered, rational world, right? That behaves according to predictable laws. gravity, right? Where would we be if gravity suddenly stopped working, right? Floating several feet off the ground. Or, well, really rocketing off into space if gravity stopped working altogether. So this is where the whole cause and effect thing comes into it, right? So if the world is rational and well-ordered and behaves according to predictable laws, that means that every effect must have a cause. Or a sufficient reason. Right? If the Bay of Lisbon exists, it must exist in order for poor James the Anabaptist to be drowned in, right? So Voltaire is making fun of Leibniz's arguments by taking them to ridiculous extremes. The other thing I want to review from last time is, do y'all remember what an argument a priori meant in philosophy? What it means to make an argument a priori. What is an a priori argument based on? Let me put it to you this way. How wide does Pangloss's experience of the world seem to be? Yeah, we know he's wrong, right? He's wrong about everything. And his experience of the world seems to be largely limited to the barony of Thunder Ten Tronc, right? What's that?
That's how you say that.
Yep, Thunder Ten Tronc.
Yeah, I was saying that.
It's okay. That's by no means the most important thing to get here. But yeah, so, and when Pangloss does experience the outside world, right, he doesn't let his experience actually change any of his beliefs or arguments, right? So is Pangloss's knowledge based on theory or based on observation?
Theory.
Yeah, everything he thinks, everything he believes and argues is based purely on theoretical deduction and not on actual observed lived experience. And that's what an a priori argument is, right? An a priori argument is based on theoretical deduction rather than observation or experience. So we talked about the Enlightenment last time generally, right? And I think what I'd like to do today to start us out is to talk a little bit about the basic structure of French society in the 18th century when Voltaire was writing, because I think that will also help you to understand some of what's going on here. So, since the Middle Ages, the French people had been divided up into a kind of class system that was referred to as the Three Estates. Right. The first estate were called Oratores, which in Latin means those who pray. So who would be the first estate? Who would make up this particular group? think about this in terms of job function. Right? Which segment of society, like for which segment of society is it their job, basically, to pray?
You want the religious group?
Yeah. The first estate is the church, specifically in France, the Catholic Church, right? Good. The identity of the second estate might be a little bit more confusing for y'all because we don't think in these terms anymore. But the second estate were called the Laboratories, which in Latin means those who fight. So who would you think that might be? That's kind of what it sounds like, right? It's actually, the nobility, right? The aristocracy. Because the original purpose of the nobility, right, was military. You had lands to generate enough income to buy armor and a horse so you could be a knight, right? So it's a kind of like, by the 18th century, this is still like no longer true. Most aristocrats aren't fighters anymore, right? But it's a reminder of the fact that the original purpose of the nobility was a military purpose. And that leaves us with the third estate, or Laboratories, which means those who work, right? So a laboratory is a place where one works, right? But the Laboratories, those who work, well, who does that leave? Well, just the poor. Yeah, basically everybody else, right? Everyone who is not in religious orders or a noble is part of the third estate. And which of these groups in society do you think had the largest numbers? This should be pretty easy to guess. Right? Yeah, this was by an enormous margin. We'll talk about how enormous the margin was when we talk a little bit more about the French Revolution and what led up to it. But yeah, the third estate was way bigger than the first or second estates, right? But which groups do you think got more privilege in society? Yeah, the nobility in the church, despite their small numbers, tended to work together to maintain a certain level of privilege, right? So this means that a small percentage of the French population enjoys a vastly more comfortable existence than everybody else, right? So, as you read like the first 60 pages or so of Candide, what did you notice about attitudes towards the nobility or towards the church? Did you notice anything in particular? How Voltaire seems to feel about either of these groups?
Every time he talked about it, he was talking like bad.
Okay, like,
or like in a way like, what was that, they better than everybody or something like that?
Okay, yeah, like, can you give me an
example?
example?
It was tension.
What's that?
I said you can tell it was tension, like,
okay.
When they were talking about the Jesuits or something like that.
Okay, yeah, do you both know who the Jesuits are? the Jesuits actually still exist. Okay, so the Jesuits are an order of Catholic priests. And at the time, right, so in the 18th century, they were heavily involved in efforts to colonize South America, right? So in efforts to, plant European colonies and create European kingdoms in South America. I think Paraguay was basically like a Jesuit-run colony before it was an independent country. So they're kind of combining the functions there of both of these estates, right? And yeah, how does Voltaire seem to feel about the Jesuits? I think this gives us a good example. What does the novella encourage us to think about the Jesuits, or how does it encourage us to view them? By the way, do you both know what a novella is and why I keep calling this a novella? Okay.
It's a novel?
Sort of. So a novella is a prose narrative that's too long to be a short story, but too short to be a novel. So it's to be a kind of like in between those two poles. Well, apart from the Jesuits, where else have we seen the church portrayed here? Like when in the reading we did for last time, for example. Where else have we seen the Catholic Church portrayed and in what light? If I tell you to look on page 13, does that give you a hint? Beginning of chapter 6. Inquisition, right? That rounds up Pangloss for speaking his mind and Candide for listening to someone speaking his mind, right? So the church seems to be associated, at least in the early part of the novella, with, on the one hand, censorship and torture, and on the other, with hypocrisy and elitism. So, given what we said about Enlightenment ideals last time, right? What seems to be Voltaire's biggest problem with the church? Or what problems does he seem to be identifying with the church?
How they think they build everybody with a right man.
Okay.
Society.
Uh-huh. Yeah, they have too much power over society, maybe, right? That might be part of it. But try to think of like some of the other things that we talked about in terms of Enlightenment ideals, right? And things that Enlightenment thinkers tended to believe in. What was what was the belief that they tended to have about expression, for example?
They thought everybody should have an opinion without judgment.
Yeah, that everybody should be allowed to express themselves freely, right? And you know, we get confused about this, and we have debates about this today, right? About, you know, the extents of free speech. And I think that people sometimes get confused about this and think that free speech means consequence-free speech, right? That I should be allowed to say whatever I want and no one is allowed to criticize me. That's not what people like Voltaire mean by free speech, right? You are free to speak your mind and someone else is free to criticize you, right? But you should certainly not be going around smashing printing presses for printing things you don't like. You should not be arresting people and torturing them for saying things you don't like, right? So he seems to associate the church particularly with that kind of censorship, right? And I think it's also important that the Jesuit that he meets in Paraguay turns out to be the Baron's son, whom he thought was dead, right? Remember what I said last time about how nobody stays dead for very long in this book? The Baron's son isn't going to stay dead either, right? He's going to be back. The only person who's going to stay dead is poor James the Anabaptist. So yeah, everybody you think is dead is going to tend to come back. So we might think about what that means as, you know, by the time we finish the book, right?
I really was getting confused because when I was reading, I thought every time they mentioned the Baron, I really thought they was talking about Candide.
Yeah, Candide is most decidedly not the Baron, right? So let's go back to page 1 here and determine like what's weird about Candide's parentage. Why couldn't his parents get married?
His mother didn't want to get married to a Saul that had 71 boys.
Okay, yeah, and I think that this might be a little bit confusing too, right? Do either of you know what they mean by quarterings here?
The last thing I remember by quarter is going in somebody's house.
Oh yeah. Yes, not that kind of quartering. No, that's that's I think is it the Fourth Amendment says that that the army can't quarter soldiers in your house without your permission, right? Not that kind of quartering, but yeah, but good thinking. So quartering in this case is actually related to genealogy. So you know how a noble family has a coat of arms, right? It's, you know, a symbol painted on a shield that represents the family. Now, when people from one noble family marry into another noble family, they will often, you know, divide the coat of arms into parts called quarters that you know, will represent the different families to which the person is related, right? So typically, it would be kind of like a divided in half, and the two most important families the person is related to would be on either side, right? They're symbols. You know, somebody who is related to many noble families might have, you know, 4 to 6 quarters on a coat of arms. So the fact that Candide's father has only 71 quarterings, right? That's an absurd number of quarterings to expect someone to have, right? So this guy is actually extremely noble and extremely well connected. Right? One of the ways that Voltaire tends to work is through exaggeration. Right? You'll see him using a lot of hyperbole. Right? Just as a kind of as a technique for ridiculing things. So the old servants of the family suspected him, that is Candide, to have been the son of the baron's sister by a good, honest gentleman of the neighborhood, whom that young lady would never marry because he had been able to prove only 71 quarterings, the rest of his genealogical tree having been lost to the injuries of time, right? So what does this tell us about the baron's family? If his sister wouldn't marry this guy because he wasn't noble enough, despite the fact that he is extremely noble, what are these people? Okay, yeah, they're fools. And I think that Voltaire would agree with that, right? That, yeah, these people are idiots. But they're also terrible elitists, right? They're terrible, terrible snobs. And I think that that's, is the reason, for example, that Candide gets kicked out of the barony because he fools around with Miss Cunegonde, or because he fools around with Miss Cunegonde while having a father with only 71 quarterings, right? I think that the Baron's son gives us our answer. If we look on page 35, right, when they have their tearful reunion, right, and they're so happy to see each other, and they're crying, and they're embracing, right? The Baron could not refrain from embracing Candide. He called him his brother, his savior, right? They grew up together. Ah, perhaps, said he, we shall together, my dear Candide, enter the town as conquerors, and recover my sister Cunegonde. That is all I want, said Candide, for I intended to marry her, and still hope to do so. You insolent, replied the Baron, would you have the impudence to marry my sister who has 72 quarterings? I find thou hast the most consummate effrontery to dare to mention so presumptuous a design. Candide, petrified at this speech, made answer, Reverend Father, all the quarterings in the world signify nothing. I rescued your sister from the arms of a Jew and of an inquisitor. She has great obligations to me. She wishes to marry me. Master Pangloss always told me that all men are equal, and certainly I will marry her. We shall see that, thou scoundrel, said the Jesuit Baron de Thunder Ten Tronckh. And that instant struck him across the face the flat of his sword. Candide in an instant drew his rapier and plunged it up to the hilt in the Jesuit's belly. But in pulling it out reeking hot, he burst into tears. So we do witness an unfortunate tendency of Candide's here. At the end of this little passage, what does he keep doing? Yeah, he keeps killing people, right? He can't seem to get out of a situation without killing someone. But what do we make of the Baron's behavior here, right? I mean, he's calling Candide his brother and his savior, and then what happens? Yeah. And why for the Baron is this an impossibility?
Because his sister has 72 quarterings.
Yes. And Candide is technically illegitimate, right? Because his father only had 71 quarterings. So this, insistence on this tiny little genealogical detail, right? On the one hand, right, is absurd and ridiculous. But then why does Candide go talking about Pangloss here and Pangloss's philosophy that all men are equal? What's being proven to Candide time and time again throughout his travels, through his experience? Yeah, that, while in principle, right, from theoretical deduction, right, a priori that might be true, but society certainly doesn't treat everyone as equal, right? Society treats someone like the Baron, who is both a nobleman and a Jesuit, better than it treats someone like Candide, who is treated better than someone like Cacambo, right? So there's a lot of criticism here of the basic social structure of France in the mid-18th century. So the social structure of France in the time leading up to the French Revolution. So I am curious, like, what did the two of you, what quotes did the two of you decide to write about?
The second one?
What's that?
For the second one?
Yeah, for today, yeah.
I put, thou hast not guessed that this abomination is, and I must at last renounce my optimism.
Okay.
Second one.
So you both picked the same one. Okay. And let's go to where that happens. Like what sparks that?
I put it back to him and Pangloss.
Okay. Well, where in the novella does this occur? Where does he finally decide he's going to renounce his optimism?
When he meets someone that has no leg or arms because of the man that he serves.
Yeah, when he meets the slave who tried to escape, right? Had his leg cut off for it, and he lost a hand in the sugar mill, right? And he's told on page, on the bottom of page 48 here, right? This is the price at which you eat sugar in Europe. So, it's a reminder that things that are like products that are being sent back to Europe for people's enjoyment, right, are created out of other people's suffering and damage to other people's lives and the breakup of other people's families, right? And the breakup of other people's bodies, right? And we can actually, I think, connect this to a larger theme. Have you noticed how suffering people are often represented as, like, in terms of body parts rather than full bodies? Like when we talk about the chapters where Candide is at war with the Bulgarians and the Avares, right? And people become collections of scattered limbs. But what's weird about the old woman? What's physically weird about the old woman who serves Cunegonde? What's she missing? It's not a leg. Why does she have to ride a horse funny?
Foot.
What's that?
A foot.
Not a foot either. What did she have cut off during a siege so that other people could eat? She only has one butt cheek. Right? So yeah, there's this tendency to reduce people, like particularly for authority figures, right? To reduce people down to collections of parts, right? So the human subject, right, instead of being treated as a whole, gets treated as various different parts that can be kind of disassembled and exploited or whatever, right? And I've never been quite sure what to do with that, but I think it's worth kind of putting a pin in and thinking about, right? Now, what were the two of you thinking when you chose that particular passage? Like, where did you what ideas did you generate from it?
I was really just trying to find something I could connect with my other,
Okay.
with my other quote.
Uh-huh.
Stuff that something I knew about, like it made sense to me.
Okay.
Cause this book don't make sense.
Okay. What's giving you trouble making sense out of it? Is it just like
I think it's the language.
Okay, because the language is
Cause
hard.
like when I was reading the first half, we had to read It was like iffy, but when I started reading the other part, I started understanding it more, but it's still like some of the language I don't understand, so some parts I understand better than others.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, and the only thing I can tell you is like it might not be a terrible idea to just like keep like an online dictionary or something.
Yeah, I had to Google somewhere.
Yeah. Well, that's good that you're doing that, right? It's good that you are doing that. Is there something about the structure of the narrative too that makes it a little hard to understand?
Not really.
Okay, so it's pretty much just on the level of language that it's troublesome. What about you? Why did you pick that book, Jennifer? What was your thinking about it?
I mean, because at first he believed in like penguins, I think.
Mm-hmm.
What he said, believe, but then as he started, as this chapters kept going, he starts to experience more how life was before he got out of the castle and whatever.
Yeah, so that the more experience of the world and other people's suffering, his own suffering, right, that Candide gets, the less it looks to him like he lives in the best of all possible worlds, right? Now, what seems to be the closest thing we've seen so far to an actual best of all possible worlds?
And something like that.
Yeah, El Dorado actually seems to be pretty great in a lot of ways, right? So tell me a little bit about El Dorado. What is El Dorado like?
People are more freedom. They don't have to pay. He didn't have to pay for his meal.
Okay, yeah, so the economy seems to be at least kind of vaguely socialized, right? That, the hostels that visitors can come to or, are free.
Well, they said people of his status don't have to pay or something like that.
Yeah, well, no one does, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No one who comes to stay at those places has to pay. What else is weird about El Dorado?
They don't care about gold or any of those type of valuable stuff that other people might think is for most people in the world.
Yeah, gold and jewels are meaningless to them, right? Like, oh, this is our dirt, right? Why are you Europeans so obsessed with our dirt, right? You all want to come and take our dirt, and we don't understand why. So gold and jewels are valueless, right? Good. What else is weird or different about their society? What's their religion like?
They think there's only one God.
Okay, yeah, they believe in one God, right? And do they ask that God for things?
No, they just thank him.
Yeah, all they do is sing songs of thanks, right? Because they've all got what they need. And what is their religion missing? What don't they have? That, say, the Catholic Church in France definitely had. Candide, having a curiosity to see the priests, asked where they were. The good old man smiled. My friend, said he, we are all priests. The king and all the heads of families sing solemn canticles of thanksgiving every morning, accompanied by 5,000 or 6,000 musicians. What? Have you no monks who teach, who dispute, who govern, who cabal, and who burn people that are not of their opinion? We must be mad indeed if that were the case, said the old man. Here we are all of one opinion, and we know not what you mean by monks. So on the literal level here, what's missing from their religion?
Priests.
Yeah, no priests, no monks, right? Which means there is no, think about that three estates theory, or that three estates mode of organizing society, right? What's that? No oratory, so no first estate, right? And while there is a king, right, does there seem to be much in the way of inequality in El Dorado? Yeah, so it seems like everyone is treated as more or less equal. So Pangloss's precept that all men are equal seems to be more or less applicable here, right? But how does El Dorado maintain this equality? How do they keep their unique society functioning?
Keeping it away from Europeans.
Yeah, they're isolationists, right? Now, on the one hand, they would have every good reason to try to hide their society from Europeans, right? Who have this violent madness for their dirt, which they don't understand in the slightest, right? But you know, which still, it's like, okay, like if this is something that can prevent, you know, keep us safe from violence, right? Then great. But in addition to them hiding the country from Europeans, do any of the people of El Dorado ever leave?
No.
Yeah, they all just stay put, right? Which, you know, it's funny, you know, Candide says, after being told about the monks and the priests, right? During this whole discourse, Candide was in raptures, bottom of page 44, and he said to himself, "This is vastly different from Westphalia and the Baron's castle. Had our friend Pangloss seen El Dorado, he would no longer have said that the castle of Thunder Ten Tronckh was the finest upon earth. It is evident that one must travel." But who doesn't travel? In fact, who tells him it's better to stay put? Yeah, the king of El Dorado says, look, you know, you know your own business, right? You know, I can't make you stay here. You're not one of my subjects. But if you happen to land in a place where things seem pretty good, right? You know, maybe best to just settle down there, right? But Candide insists that one must travel in order to have things to, you know, to compare other things to, right? So his argument here about Pangloss, that Pangloss had no basis for comparison with Thunder Ten Tronckh, right? And let's look at what, let's just go back for a second and look at what Thunder Ten Tronckh was like. We go back to page 1 here. The Baron was one of the most powerful lords in Westphalia, for his castle had not only a gate, but windows. His great hall, even, was hung with tapestry. All the dogs of his farmyards formed a pack of hounds at his need, his grooms were his huntsmen, and the curate of the village was his grand almoner. They called him my lord and laughed at all his stories. So what is it that makes the Baron's castle great compared to other castles in Westphalia? For context, I should let you know Westphalia is a real place in Germany, and traditionally it's been regarded as a kind of rural backwater. What's the evidence of the Baron's power and wealth and greatness? What does his castle have?
Has gates and windows.
Yeah, ooh, he has a gate and he has windows, right? He even has a fucking tapestry in his great hall. Woohoo, right? So, whereas the whole thing about, you know, nobility and aristocracy and quarterings was based on hyperbole, here the joke is based on understatement, right? Like an ironic understatement, right? And then let's look at what the King of El Dorado's castle looks like. On page 45 at the bottom. No, actually, sorry, 45 at the top, right? Candide and Cacambo got into the coach. The 6 sheep flew, and in less than 4 hours they reached the king's palace situated at the extremity of the capital. The portal was 220 feet high and 100 wide, but words are wanting to express the materials of which it was built. It is plain such materials must have prodigious superiority over those pebbles and sands, which we call gold and precious stones. And a little further down, right? While waiting, they were shown the city and saw the public edifices raised as high as the clouds, the marketplaces ornamented with 1,000 columns, the fountains of spring water, those of rose water, those of liquors drawn from sugarcane, incessantly flowing into the great squares, which were paved with a kind of precious stone, which gave off a delicious fragrancy like that of cloves and cinnamon. Candide asked to see the court of justice, the parliament. They told him they had none, and that they were strangers to lawsuits. He asked if they had any prisons, and they answered no. But what surprised him most and gave him the greatest pleasure was the Palace of Sciences, where he saw a gallery 2,000 feet long and filled with instruments employed in mathematics and physics. So first off, just in terms of physical grandeur, how does El Dorado compare to Thunder Ten Tronc?
You gotta build a setup outside the town.
Yeah, I mean, well, for one thing, there's a city, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a castle with a bunch of pigsties, right? They've got a real city with all of these beautiful fountains and paved stones and beautiful scents, right? The king's palace is enormous, right? The gate alone is 220 feet high and 100 wide. You know, it's made of beautiful materials too beautiful to be expressed in words. So it looks like things are pretty different here from Thunder Ten Tronc. However, right, why don't they have a court of justice or prisons? And maybe we can relate this to why they don't have priests or monks. What does no one ever do?
Get in trouble.
And why doesn't anyone ever get in trouble?
Because they don't have any, they didn't have no treatment.
Okay, yeah, so there's full equality across the population, right? And what does that equality extend to here?
Trust.
Okay, yeah, social trust, right? Everybody trusts everybody else. Let's go back to page 44 for a second, right? Here we are all of one opinion. So we have no priests, no courts, right? No parliament, so we have no meaningful government. And no prisons. But when the king says, here we are all of one opinion, what else is he suggesting they don't have? If everyone is of one opinion,
They don't have mind their own.
yeah, like nobody ever disagrees about anything, right? Yeah, there's no disagreement here. Good. And, you know, while the people seem, you know, happy and seem to more or less like things this way, right? It also kind of limits that free expression.
I was just going to ask you, so do you think that Candide think if it's another possible best world, but the people that actually live there don't, because they don't get to do nothing else or explore anything outside their world.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think, yeah, I think that's kind of where I'm going here. This is why we went back to Thunderton Trunk first, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it seemed pretty great when you didn't know anything else. And I think that the same kind of thing is happening in El Dorado, right? Now, El Dorado is way nicer, right? Everything there is a lot better than everything in Thunderton Trunk, but it suffers from the same problem, right? It's a bubble. Nobody ever disagrees about anything. Nobody ever leaves or goes anywhere. So everything just kind of continues on as it always has, right? And you know, whether that's a well-ordered egalitarian society where people are more or less happy, right? That's great, sure. But I think that that Voltaire also thinks that's a little bit problematic. Because I think he does feel that we need experience in order to really understand the world that we live in. Now, I also, we're running a little, we started a couple minutes early, so we're running a little bit low on time, but I want to talk for a little bit here also about this guy Candide picks up at the end of the section you read for today, this guy Martin. What's Martin like?
He's the opposite of Pangloss.
Yeah, he's kind of Pangloss' evil twin, right? He is complete opposite philosophy. So if Pangloss believes we live in the best of all possible worlds, what does Martin believe?
We live in the worst.
Yeah. And even if this isn't the worst of all possible worlds, but things could still get worse, right? Things are pretty much always shit. And one thing I'm going to say, kind of as we read the rest of this, right, is that I don't think Voltaire believes Martin's philosophy is entirely right, but I don't think he thinks it's entirely wrong either. And I think he does actually point out some things to Candide that are more valuable than things that Candide learns from Pangloss. Like, for example, when they're at sea and the ship sinks, not their ship, but the ship that's involved in the sea battle, and it turns out that it's the Dutch pirate and slaver who tricked Candide and stole the sheep. And the sheep comes swimming back to the ship and Candide rescues it, right, page 53. Right. You see, said Candide to Martin, that crime is sometimes punished. This rogue of a Dutch skipper has met with the fate he deserved. Yes, said Martin, but why should the passengers be doomed also to destruction? God has punished the knave, and the devil has drowned the rest. So what's the problem with Candide's idea of justice in this situation that Martin is pointing out?
And just because one person did the wrong thing doesn't mean he should say everybody else that did it.
Yeah, well, and who specifically was a wrong done to? Who did this Dutch captain specifically wrong? Now, we know actually that he wronged the slave as well, right? But is Candide even thinking of that?
Mm-hmm.
No. In fact, Candide leaves the slave weeping, right? But one thing I think it is really important to know, but kind of hard to deal with, is he doesn't do anything to help the guy, right? Or to change the situation. He just leaves weeping. But in terms of this Dutch captain, right? Candide is thinking only of the wrong done to him, and that this specific piece of shit who did something wrong to him has now been punished for it, right? And then what is Martin pointing out to Candide? Does the world actually center around Candide and his problems? Yeah. Other people matter too, right? And even though this may seem just to you, because you got your stuff back, right? It wasn't just to the 100 innocent people on that ship who drowned, right? So seeing, you know, looking at the world from too self-centered a position, right, leads us also to a sort of blindness that devalues other people's lives. And I think that maybe that's how we can relate this to the episode with the slave, right? For one thing, they're connected by a single character, right? They're connected by that Dutch captain. But they're both reminders of how thinking only about our own luxuries or our own pleasures, right, leads us to devalue or excuse the suffering of other people. All right, so we're about out of time now. Do either of you have any further questions or observations? I think we're actually making pretty good progress through this.
I got a question. So basically, this book is about Candide exploring the world outside of Tin Trunk.
Essentially, yeah. And you know, the way actual, like, gaining actual experience of the world proves this, you know, philosophy of radical optimism, right? That everything's for the best, right? The universe is designed to be good to you. That this turns out to be basically horseshit.
We got questions.
I got questions. We've all got questions. If we didn't, we wouldn't be